He said it like he was talking about the weather, like he was telling me to take out the trash or close the door on my way out. My father stood in the hallway of our house in Coventry, the house I had grown up in, the house where my bedroom still had the faded blue curtains my mother picked out before she died, and he said, "You've got until morning. Pack what you can carry." I was 24 years old. I was 11 weeks pregnant, and I was standing there holding a glass of water I had poured for myself from the kitchen tap, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the glass was still cold in my hand while everything else was burning. He had found the pregnancy test. Not the one I took, the backup. The one I had bought just to be sure, still sealed in the box, tucked into the bottom of my handbag. I had left the bag on the kitchen counter when I came in from work, and he must have been looking for something. Or maybe he was just looking, the way he always looked through my things like they were his to inspect. Like privacy was a privilege I hadn't earned. He found the box. He opened it. And then he sat in his chair in the living room, and he waited for me. The box on the arm of the chair like evidence in a courtroom. I didn't even get to say the father's name. I didn't get to explain that I had a plan, that I had been saving, that the man I was seeing was decent and kind and wanted this baby. None of that mattered. What mattered was the test, the box, the proof that I had done something without his permission. "You've got until morning." My younger brother, Daniel, was sitting on the stairs. He was 19. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me with this expression I still can't fully describe. Something between sorry and relieved that the attention wasn't on him. My father's girlfriend, Sandra, was in the kitchen pretending to wipe the counter. She had been living with us for 3 years by then, sleeping in the bedroom that used to belong to my parents, wearing the apron my mother used to wear at Christmas. And she didn't look up. Not once. My name is Charlotte Ashworth. I'm 31 years old now. I work as a structural engineer for a firm in Birmingham, and I specialize in heritage restoration, the kind of buildings people assume will stand forever until someone shows them the cracks underneath. I'm good at finding what's broken in things that look whole. I suppose that's not an accident. This is the story of how my father threw me out of my own family for getting pregnant, how he spent years telling everyone I had abandoned him, how he rewrote the history of our family so completely that even my brother believed it, and how one phone call from a solicitor in Leamington Spa undid every lie he had ever told. But it's also the story of my grandfather, a man named Arthur Ashworth, who saw everything, said little, and planned further ahead than any of us knew. I need to go back. You need to understand what kind of house this was, what kind of family, because from the outside it looked perfectly normal. Terraced house on Braes Lane, tidy front garden, bins always out on time. My father, Keith Ashworth, was a sales manager for a building supplies company. He wore polo shirts with the company logo. He played darts at the Stag and Pheasant on Fridays. He was the kind of man neighbors would describe as solid, dependable, a bit strict maybe, but raising 2 kids on his own after his wife died. What do you expect? My mother died when I was 12, ovarian cancer. It took 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. I remember the funeral more clearly than I remember most of my childhood. I remember the smell of the lilies on the coffin and how they smelled nothing like the flowers in our garden. I remember my grandfather, my father's father, standing at the back of the church in his dark coat, and he was the only person there who wasn't crying. Not because he didn't feel it, because he was watching. He was always watching. After the funeral, Grandpa Arthur pulled me aside in the churchyard. I was 12 years old and wearing shoes that were too tight because my mother had bought them 6 months earlier and my feet had grown. He knelt down, which was hard for him because his right knee had been bad since he fell off scaffolding in 1972, and he looked at me directly and said, "Charlotte, the world will try to make you small. Don't let it. But don't fight loud. Fight quiet. Quiet lasts longer." I didn't understand what he meant. I was 12. I wanted my mother. But those words stayed in me, like a seed planted in soil that wasn't ready yet. They just waited. After Mum died, my father changed. Or maybe he didn't change. Maybe he just stopped pretending. The strictness became control. The discipline became surveillance. He checked my school bag every evening. He timed how long it took me to walk home. If I was more than 5 minutes late, he would stand at the door and ask me to explain every minute. And if I couldn't, I lost my phone for the week. He read my diary when I was 14. I know because he quoted it back to me at dinner, in front of Daniel, laughing about a boy I had written about, a boy named Marcus who sat next to me in maths and had nice handwriting. "Charlotte's got a boyfriend," he said, and when I started crying, he told me to stop being dramatic. I learned not to write things down after that. I learned not to leave traces. I learned that in my father's house, having an inner life was a form of disobedience. Grandpa Arthur saw it. He never confronted my father directly, at least not that I saw. But he did things, small things. He would show up on Saturday mornings and take me to the Coventry Transport Museum or the Herbert Art Gallery, and in the car he would ask me questions no one else asked. "What are you reading? What do you think about it? What kind of work do you want to do someday?" He listened to my answers like they mattered. He was the only adult in my life who treated my thoughts as if they had weight. When I was 16, I told him I wanted to be an engineer. He nodded like I had said something completely obvious. "Your grandmother was better with numbers than anyone I ever met," he said. "She could look at a set of plans and tell you where the stress would show up 20 years later. You've got that same eye, Charlotte." He paused. "Don't tell your father until it's done." Don't tell your father until it's done. That became the second rule Grandpa Arthur gave me. The first was fight quiet. The second was finish before you announce. I didn't realize until much later that he was giving me a survival manual. I got into the University of Sheffield to study civil engineering. My father told everyone at the pub that he was proud, that he had pushed me toward it, that all his discipline had paid off. He told no one that Grandpa Arthur had paid for my A-level tutoring, had driven me to the open day, had sat with me while I wrote my personal statement. My father's version of the story had no room for anyone's contribution but his own. That pattern, taking credit for things he didn't build and punishing things he couldn't control, that was the engine of my father's life. I just didn't have words for it yet. Not then. But they were coming. I should tell you who I am properly because you'll need to understand the shape of me to understand why what happened later hurt the way it did, and why I survived it. My name is Elaine Hargrove. I was 22 when I graduated from Sheffield with a first in civil engineering, the only woman in a cohort of 31. I was 23 when I started at Mott MacDonald's Leeds office, doing structural assessments on social housing retrofits across West Yorkshire. I was 24 when I got my first solo project sign-off, a load-bearing wall recalculation for a council estate in Hare Hills that 3 senior engineers had gotten wrong. My line manager, a man named Desmond Price, who had been doing this work since Thatcher's second term, pulled me aside in the corridor that afternoon and said something I carry with me still. He said, "Elaine, you have the rarest quality an engineer can have. You see what isn't there yet, not just what is." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said thank you and went back to my desk and ate a sandwich. But I kept it. I was not the kind of woman people noticed in a room. I was 5'4" with narrow shoulders and a habit of standing near the wall. I wore my hair pulled back because it was practical, not because I cared about looking severe. My hands were always dry from washing them too often. a leftover from childhood when my father would inspect them before meals and flick my knuckles with a butter knife if they weren't clean enough. I bit the inside of my cheek when I was thinking. I still do. There's a ridge of scar tissue on the left side that my dentist once asked about, and I told her it was nothing. And she looked at me in that way dentists do when they know you're lying, but it isn't their business. I was quiet. People mistook that for weakness constantly, and I let them, because correcting them would have cost energy I needed for other things. My father certainly mistook it. He saw my silence as submission. He saw my patience as fear. He saw my willingness to let him take credit and shout and rearrange history as proof that his version of reality was the correct one. He never once considered that I was simply choosing not to fight battles I couldn't win yet. Grandpa Arthur had taught me that. Choose the ground, he'd say. Never fight on someone else's terrain. Arthur Hargrove was my father's father, though you wouldn't know it from the way they moved through the world. My father was loud and broad and filled every room he entered with the sound of his own certainty. Arthur was thin, precise, spoke like he was rationing words during a shortage. He had been a quantity surveyor for 43 years, working on projects across the north of England, bridges and reservoirs, and the kinds of infrastructure that nobody thinks about until it fails. He retired to a stone cottage outside Grassington in the Dales, with a view of the river wharf and a workshop in the back where he built furniture nobody asked for. He built me a bookcase when I was 11, dovetail joints, no nails. It's still standing in a flat he never saw me move into. Arthur's wife, my grandmother Ruth, died of pancreatic cancer when I was 9. He never remarried. He never even mentioned the possibility. When I asked him about it once, as a teenager trying to understand love, he said, "Some things you only get one of, Elaine. Don't waste yours on someone who makes you feel smaller than you are." I didn't understand that then. I thought he was talking about romance. He wasn't. Or not only. He was the one who noticed things. When I was 14 and came home from school with a bruise on my forearm where my father had grabbed me for speaking out of turn at dinner the night before, Arthur didn't say anything directly. He just started showing up more. Tuesdays and Thursdays. He'd take me to the library in Skipton or drive me out to the reservoir at Grimwith, and we'd walk the perimeter in silence. And sometimes he'd say things that sounded like observations about weather or stone walls, but were actually instructions. Walls that lean too far eventually fall on the person standing closest. Pressure builds fastest in closed systems. The ground always remembers what was built on it, even after the building's gone. I collected these phrases like coins. I didn't spend them. Not yet. My mother, Janet, was a teaching assistant at the local primary school. She was kind in the way that people who have surrendered are kind, gently, without edges, because edges had been sanded off her years ago. She loved me. I have never doubted that. But she loved me from inside a cage she had stopped trying to leave. And the love that comes through bars is warm, but it cannot protect you. She would leave cups of tea outside my bedroom door after my father's worst evenings. She would smooth my hair in the morning and say nothing about the night before. She was complicit in the way that silence is always complicit, not with cruelty, but with the permission that cruelty needs to continue. I don't blame her. I did once. I was 19, home for Christmas, and she asked me why I never called. And I almost said, "Because you never once stood between him and me." But I looked at her hands, red from washing dishes in water that was too hot because my father complained about spots on the glasses, and I swallowed it. Some truths are true, and still not worth saying to the person they'd destroy. So that was the shape of me when everything that follows began. An engineer who saw what wasn't there yet. A woman made quiet by practice, not by nature. A granddaughter carrying a dead man's phrases like tools in a belt, waiting for the moment she'd need them. And a daughter who had learned, long before she should have had to, that the people who are supposed to love you the most are sometimes the people least capable of seeing you at all. I carried all of that into the year I turned 26, the year the phone call came, the year my father's version of reality finally met the version that was actually true. I need to tell you about the pattern, because people always want to know the single moment everything went wrong, the one fight, the one sentence. But it was never one thing with my father. It was years of things, small and ordinary, stacked so carefully that from the outside they looked like nothing at all. The first time I really understood my place was at my cousin Derek's graduation party. I was 19. I had just finished my second year at Georgia Tech with a 3.94 GPA, and I had been selected for a summer research fellowship at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which, if you don't know, is one of the premier federal research facilities in the country. 14 students chosen nationally. I was one of them. I told my father about it on a Tuesday evening while he was watching the Braves game, and he said, without looking away from the television, "That's nice. Pass the remote." 2 weeks later, at Derek's party, Derek announced he'd gotten an associate's degree in business administration from a community college in Dalton. My father stood up from the folding chair, crossed the backyard, put both hands on Derek's shoulders, and said, loud enough for everyone under the tent to hear, "This right here is what a man with ambition looks like." He bought Derek a Fossil watch that afternoon, $65. I know because I saw the receipt on the counter. He never mentioned Oak Ridge again. Not once, not in passing, not to anyone. I didn't cry about it. I went back to my room and I recalculated stress loads on a cantilever beam until the numbers were clean and my breathing was even. That was the first time. The second time was the house. My parents' house on Ridgewood Drive needed a new roof in 2019. I was 23, already working, already making decent money at the firm. My father asked my brother Thomas to handle it, but Thomas was living in Savannah and didn't want to deal with contractors from 3 hours away, so I volunteered. I spent 4 weekends driving from Atlanta to Cedartown. I got 3 bids, negotiated the best one down by $1,100, supervised the crew myself because I knew enough about structural loads to catch problems the roofers might miss. I caught one, actually. A section of decking near the chimney that was soft with moisture damage. If they'd shingled over it, the whole area would have failed within 2 years. I flagged it, got it replaced, saved my parents probably $4,000 in future repairs. When the job was done, my father told his friend Bill Patterson at church that Thomas had taken care of everything. Thomas, who had driven up once on a Saturday, stayed for lunch and left before the crew finished for the day. I was standing right there when he said it. He looked at me, looked through me, and kept talking. The third time was Christmas 2020. I had given my mother a handmade photo album, 60 pages, leather-bound, photos I'd collected and restored from old boxes in the attic. Some of them were from her childhood in Carrollton, photos she thought were lost. She cried when she opened it, genuine tears. My father gave her a Keurig coffee maker, still in the box, price tag on the bottom. When relatives came over that afternoon and asked about gifts, my father held up the Keurig and said he'd finally found the perfect thing for her. The photo album sat on the side table. Nobody mentioned it. My mother caught my eye once from across the kitchen and gave me a look that was half gratitude and half apology, but she didn't say anything either. She never did, not in front of him. And the fourth time, the one that mattered most, This was February 2021, 5 months before the phone call that changed everything. I had just received my PE license, my professional engineer certification, which in Georgia requires 4 years of qualifying experience, a 16-hour exam, and references from 3 licensed engineers. It is not a casual achievement. It changes your legal authority, your professional standing, your earning potential. I told my father at Sunday dinner. He was cutting a pork chop. He said, and I remember this with the precision of someone who has replayed it too many times, "Well, I hope that means you can finally afford to stop borrowing trouble." I didn't know what that meant. I still don't. My mother changed the subject to the weather. Thomas asked if there was more sweet tea, and the conversation moved on as if I had said nothing at all. I sat at that table, and I felt something I want to describe carefully because it matters. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was the feeling of standing in an empty field and realizing the house you thought was behind you was never built. The foundation was never poured. There was nothing to go back to because there had never been anything there. I had been furnishing an empty lot in my mind for 25 years, hanging curtains on windows that did not exist. After dinner, I helped my mother wash the dishes. She handed me a plate and said quietly, "He doesn't mean it the way it sounds." And I said, "I know, Mama." Because what else could I say? She was surviving him too, in her own way, and I did not have the right to take that from her. But I dried that plate, and I put it in the cabinet, and something inside me shifted. Not broke, shifted, like a beam accepting a new load, redistributing weight to points that could hold it. I was done asking that man to see me. I was done performing my life for an audience that had never bought a ticket. That was a Tuesday in November. I remember because the next morning I drove to the clinic for my 12-week appointment, and the ultrasound tech turned the screen toward me, and I saw the heartbeat for the first time. Not heard it, saw it. A tiny flicker in a gray sea, no bigger than a grain of rice, pulsing against the dark. I held my breath, and the tech said, "Everything looks perfect." And I nodded and said thank you, and walked to my car and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes with both hands on the steering wheel, watching rain slide down the windshield. I was not crying. I was recalculating. There is a moment in structural work, real structural work, when you realize the blueprint you have been following is wrong. Not slightly off, wrong. The foundation was poured at the wrong angle. The load-bearing walls are in the wrong place, and everything you have built on top of it is stable only by accident. You have 2 choices. You can keep building and hope, or you can stop, strip it back, and start from what is actually solid. Most people keep building. I understand why. Starting over feels like failure. But the building does not care about your feelings. Physics does not negotiate. I had spent 25 years building my life on the assumption that my father's approval was a load-bearing wall. It was not. It was decorative. It had never held anything up. The things that had actually carried me were different. Grandpa Hank's voice on the phone every Sunday evening when I was at Georgia Tech, asking me not about grades, but about whether I was eating enough and whether I had found a good church. My own stubbornness, which people mistook for patience. The quiet fact that I had never once failed an inspection on any job site I managed, not once in 6 years, because I checked everything twice, and I documented everything, and I did not leave until it was right. Those were my load-bearing walls. And none of them required my father to say he was proud of me. So the shift that happened over my mother's kitchen sink was not dramatic. It was not a door slamming or a vow whispered into a mirror. It was engineering. I looked at the structure of my life, and I identified what was actually holding weight. and I stopped pretending the decorative column in the center was doing anything at all. 2 weeks later, I told him. I did not plan a speech. I did not wait for the right moment. I was at their house for Sunday lunch because my mother had made pot roast and she had asked me twice, and I could not say no to her twice. My father was in his chair talking about a foreman at his company who had been fired for falsifying safety reports, and he was laughing about it. Not about the falsifying, but about the man's face when he was caught. And I was sitting on the couch with a glass of water and I said, I have something to tell you both. My mother looked up. She knew. I think she had known for weeks. Women know. I said, I am pregnant, 13 weeks. The father is not in the picture, and I am keeping the baby, and I am not asking for opinions. The room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture, like wet concrete before it sets. My mother put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled, and she said, Oh, sweetheart. And she started to stand. My father said, Sit down, June. She sat. He looked at me, and I watched his face go through something. Not shock exactly, something colder, like a man reviewing evidence and arriving at a verdict he had already written. He said, Whose is it? I said, That is not your concern. He said, It is my concern if my daughter is going to throw her life away. I said, I am not throwing anything away. He said, You are 31 years old and unmarried and pregnant, and you think that is not throwing your life away? I said, I think my life is mine to throw. That was the wrong thing to say. Or the right thing. I still do not know. He stood up. He was not a tall man, but he had always known how to fill a room, the same way a small fire fills a room, not with size, but with heat. He said, I will not support this. He said, You will not bring a child into this family without a father and expect me to smile about it. He said, You have made your choice, and now you can live with it, but not under any roof I pay for. I said, I have not lived under your roof in 13 years. He said, Then it should be easy for you to keep not doing it. My mother was crying. She was not making noise about it, just tears running down her face into the collar of her blouse, a pale blue blouse with small white flowers on it. I remember that detail because I stared at those flowers while my father told me to leave his house. I stared at those tiny white flowers, and I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, the way the counselor at Georgia Tech had taught me during finals week a decade ago. And I stood up, and I picked up my purse, and I walked to the door. My mother said, Carl, please. He did not answer her. I drove home. I did not cry. I was past it. I had already done my grieving at my mother's kitchen sink 2 weeks before, drawing a plate that was not mine, in a house that had never really been mine either. The eviction from his table was just paperwork. The real departure had already happened. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my own kitchen table in my own apartment that I paid for with my own salary, and I put my hand flat on my stomach where there was barely a curve yet, and I said out loud, It is you and me, kid. 3 days later, my phone rang. The area code was Savannah. The voice on the other end said, Good afternoon, am I speaking with Ellie Holcomb? And I said yes. And the voice said, My name is Martin Adler. I am an attorney with Pemberton and Adler, and I am calling regarding the estate of Henry William Holcomb. I said, My grandfather passed 8 months ago. His estate was already settled. Martin Adler paused. Then he said, Not entirely, Ms. Holcomb. Not entirely. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and the tea going cold in my other hand, and I listened to Martin Adler explain something, that took me several minutes to fully absorb. He spoke slowly, the way attorneys do when they know the information they are delivering will rearrange someone's understanding of their own life. Henry William Holcomb, my grandfather, had maintained a separate trust. Not the one my father had administered after the funeral, not the one that distributed the house and the savings account and the fishing boat and the workshop tools in neat parcels mostly to my father and uncle. This was a different instrument entirely. Grandpa had established it in 2014, nearly a decade before he died, and he had funded it quietly over the years with transfers from a brokerage account that nobody in the family knew existed. The trustee was Martin Adler. The sole beneficiary was me. I asked how much. Martin Adler told me. I put the tea down because my hand was shaking. It was not a fortune by the standards of people who inherit fortunes, but by the standards of a 29-year-old civil engineer pulling $52,000 a year before taxes, pregnant and freshly disowned, it was enough to change the physics of my situation entirely. The trust held $412,000 in a mix of index funds and treasury bonds. There was also the deed to a small commercial property on Broughton Street in Savannah that Grandpa had purchased in 1998 and leased to a bookshop for 25 years. The lease was up for renewal, and the current tenant wanted to stay. Monthly rent was $1,700. I asked Martin Adler why I was only hearing about this now. He said Grandpa's instructions were specific. The trust was to be disclosed to me only upon the occurrence of one of 3 triggering events: my 30th birthday, my marriage, or the birth or confirmed pregnancy of my first child. Martin Adler said he had received a call from my mother 3 days ago telling him I was pregnant. My mother, who had been named in the trust documents as the notification contact. My mother, who I had assumed was standing silently behind my father during all of this, complicit by passivity. I asked him to repeat that. He did. My mother had called the attorney. My mother had triggered the trust. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Martin Adler said he would send the full documents by certified mail, and that we would need to meet in Savannah within 30 days to sign the acceptance paperwork and discuss management options. He wished me congratulations on the pregnancy. His voice was warm in a way that felt like it came from knowing my grandfather and not just administering his money. Over the following weeks, I did not tell anyone. Not Darren, not my mother, not a single person at work. I went to my desk every morning and designed drainage systems for a subdivision in Chatham County, and I came home every evening and I ate dinner and I read the documents Martin Adler sent me, and I began to understand just how carefully my grandfather had built this. He had included a letter. It was handwritten on the same yellow legal pad paper he used for everything, the kind he bought in bulk from the office supply store on Abercorn. It was dated March 2014. It said, "Ellie, if you are reading this, then one of 3 things has happened, and I suspect it is not your 30th birthday, because I suspect you will need this before then. Your father is my son, and I love him, but I have watched him, and I know what he is. He measures people by whether they do what he expects, and he has never once asked himself whether what he expects is reasonable. You are the one in this family who builds things. Build something he cannot take from you." I read that letter 4 times. Then I folded it and put it in the fireproof lockbox I kept under my bed, the one where I stored my passport and my car title, and the ultrasound photo from my 12-week appointment. I began meeting with Martin Adler every other Saturday. I drove down to Savannah early in the morning before the heat settled over the city, and I sat in his office on Drayton Street with the ceiling fan turning slowly above us, and we went through everything. He was 71 years old, and he had been Grandpa's attorney for 30 years, and he treated me with a respect that felt like a continuation of something my grandfather had started. He did not simplify things for me. He showed me the account statements and the property records and the tax history, and he answered every question I asked. And when I asked good questions, he said so. I asked him once if Grandpa had ever mentioned why he set it up the way he did. Martin Adler looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Your grandfather told me that the people who need safety nets the most are always the ones who get told they do not deserve them." He said you reminded him of his own mother. I never met Grandpa's mother. She died before I was born. But I knew from the stories that she had raised 4 children alone after her husband's truck went off Route 17 into the marsh in 1961. And she had done it without complaint and without help and without ever once being thanked. I did not confront my father. I did not call my mother to thank her, though I wanted to. I was not ready yet, because I was not finished. I had the resources now, but I needed the plan. And I needed the plan to be airtight because I knew my father, and I knew that when he found out about this trust, he would react exactly the way he reacted to everything that challenged his authority. He would try to take it apart. So I spent 3 months being invisible. I worked. I went to prenatal appointments. I felt the baby move for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in October while sitting in traffic on Victory Drive, and I pulled over and put both hands on my belly and I cried. But they were not sad tears. They were the kind that come when you realize you have been holding your breath for years and you finally have enough air. 3 months of being invisible, and then the invitation arrived. My father was turning 60, and my mother was throwing a dinner at the Marriott on 14th Street downtown. She called me herself, which surprised me. She said, "Your father wants the whole family there." I almost laughed because I knew that was not true. What my father wanted was the appearance of the whole family there. He wanted the long table and the matching faces and the photograph that proved nothing had cracked. I was 7 months pregnant by then. There was no hiding it. I think that was why my mother's voice had that thin, careful quality on the phone, like she was reading from a script someone else had written. She said, "Please, just come and do not make it a thing." I said I would be there. I spent the week before that dinner not sleeping much. Not because I was afraid. I had passed through afraid somewhere around month 4, and come out the other side into something harder and quieter. I was not afraid of my father. I was afraid of doing this wrong, of letting anger make me sloppy. Attorney Kessler had prepared everything. The trust was locked, the property transfers were filed and recorded with the Muskogee County Clerk's office. My grandfather's will had been structured by a man who understood exactly who his son was and had built walls accordingly. Walls my father could not climb over, dig under, or talk his way through. I had all of it in a leather folder that I kept in the trunk of my car. I was not planning to bring it inside. I was planning to let the evening happen and see what my father did, because I had learned something important in those 3 months of silence. I had learned that he always did it to himself. You just had to wait. The Marriott ballroom had those brass chandeliers that make everything look warmer than it is. There were about 40 people. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people from my father's car dealerships, people from his church. He attended First Baptist on Macon Road every Sunday and sat in the 3rd pew and shook the pastor's hand. And I think he genuinely believed he was a good man. That was the thing about my father. He was not performing goodness as a disguise. He believed it. He believed that throwing his pregnant, unmarried daughter out of his house was the moral thing to do. He believed the money my grandfather left was rightfully his because he was the son. He believed these things the way you believe the floor is solid. He never checked. I walked in wearing a dark blue dress that did not hide anything. I was showing, and I was not ashamed of it. My mother saw me first, and her face did something complicated. She crossed the room fast and touched my arm and said, "You look beautiful." And I could tell she meant it, and also that she wished I had not come. My brother David was there with his wife, and he nodded at me from across the room, but did not come over. My sister Karen stared at my belly and then looked away. Nobody said congratulations. My father was holding court near the bar. He had a glass of bourbon and he was telling a story, and people were laughing the way people laugh at someone who signs their paychecks. He saw me and the story stopped. Just stopped mid-sentence. The silence spread outward from him like a drop of ink in water. I watched his face go through several things. Surprise, then anger, then the thing he always did, which was to rearrange his expression into something controlled and faintly disappointed, the way you might look at a stain on a tablecloth. He walked over to me. He did not rush. He wanted everyone to see that he was calm. He stopped about 3 feet away and looked at my belly, and then looked at my face and said, "I thought we had an understanding." I said we did not have an understanding. You made a decision and I left. He did not like that. His jaw moved the way it does when he is biting down on something he wants to say. He said, "This is not the place." I said, "I agree." He said, "Then why did you come looking like that?" Like that. As if my body carrying a child was an act of aggression against him. I said because Mom invited me and because Grandpa would have wanted me here. That was the sentence that changed his color. Not red. He went pale. Because he knew. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that the conversation had shifted to territory he did not control, and the mention of my grandfather was not casual. I watched his hand tighten around his glass. It was quiet enough now that people at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen. My Aunt Rebecca was watching with her napkin frozen halfway to her lap. My father's business partner, Jim Hodges, was standing by the podium looking uncomfortable. My father leaned in and said low enough that he thought only I could hear, "Whatever you think you know about your grandfather's estate, you need to understand that was handled. That is done. That is family business and it is settled." I did not lean in. I spoke at normal volume. I said, "It is settled. You are right about that. It is settled in a trust that Grandpa established in 2014 with Kessler and Associates, and it names me as the sole beneficiary of the Whitesville Road properties and the associated accounts. It was settled before he died. You just were not told." The glass in his hand did not drop, but it stopped moving. It just hung there in the air between his chest and his mouth, as if his arm had forgotten what it was doing. I had never seen my father freeze. He was a man who always had the next sentence ready. Always. And for 5 seconds, he had nothing. Then he said, "That is not possible." I said, "I have the documents in my car." He said, "Your grandfather would never." I said he did. And then I said the part that I had practiced in my bathroom mirror at 2 a.m. while the baby kicked. I said he did because he knew you would do exactly what you did. He knew that if I ever needed help and you were the one who decided whether I got it, I would not get it. So he made sure I did not have to ask you. My father set the glass down on the nearest table. He set it down carefully, precisely, the way you set down something fragile when your hands are shaking and you do not want anyone to see. He looked at my mother. She was standing 6 feet behind me, and I did not turn around, but I heard her breath catch. He looked at her and said, "Did you know about this?" She did not answer right away, which was an answer. He said, "Margaret." She said, "I found out after he passed. I did not know the details." The room was not pretending anymore. 40 people were watching my father stand in front of his pregnant daughter in a Marriott ballroom and realize that his own father had looked at him clearly, seen what he was, and planned around him the way you plan around a flood. Not with anger, with engineering. He did not yell, I will give him that. He did not make a scene in the way people expect. He straightened his jacket, and he looked at me, and he said, "You are not my daughter." And he said it quietly, almost gently, the way you might close a door you never intend to open again. Then he walked back to the bar and picked up a fresh glass and resumed his conversation with Jim Hodges, as if I had evaporated. I stood there for another 10 seconds. I felt the baby shift. I put my hand on my belly, and I turned and walked out through the lobby and into the parking lot, where the air was cool and smelled like exhaust and pine trees. And I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off, not crying, not shaking, just sitting with my hands on the steering wheel, feeling the enormous quiet of having said the true thing in the room where the true thing had never once been welcome. The first call came at 6 a.m. 3 days later. I know because I was already awake. I had been awake since 4, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment Grandpa's trust had provided, eating saltines and reading the lease agreement for the 3rd time, because I wanted to understand every clause, every obligation, every protection. The phone buzzed and I saw the name. Dad. I let it ring. It rang 11 times and then stopped, and then started again immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind, because my father was not a man who called twice. He was a man who called once and expected you to answer, and if you didn't, he decided you were the problem and moved on. I let it ring again. Then I made tea. He called 4 more times that day. The 5th time he left a voicemail. I listened to it that evening while I was folding the baby clothes that Ruth Perkins had dropped off in a paper bag, with a note that said these were her granddaughters, but her granddaughter was 12 now and wouldn't miss them. His voice on the message was controlled, almost professional. He said, "Elena, I think there has been a misunderstanding about some of your grandfather's arrangements, and I would appreciate a call back at your earliest convenience." He said earliest convenience the way a creditor says it, not a father, a creditor. I saved the voicemail. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted proof that this was real, that I hadn't imagined the shift, that the man who had told a room full of people I was not his daughter was now calling me 5 times in one day because he had learned what Arthur Maddox knew all along. That silence has a price. That patience has a yield. What happened was straightforward. Harold Endicott had done exactly what he said he would do. The morning after the gala, he filed the formal notifications with the county recorder's office and the bank and the family's estate attorney. The Maddox Family Trust, as restructured in my grandfather's final amendment, named me as primary beneficiary and sole trustee of the operational accounts. The house on Lakeview, the commercial property on Main Street, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio that Grandpa had built quietly over 40 years of careful decisions. All of it. Not because I had asked, not because I had schemed, because an old man with engine grease under his fingernails had watched his son become someone he didn't recognize and had decided, in the last clear years of his life, to protect the person who reminded him most of himself. The total value of the estate was $1.4 million. I know that number sounds enormous. It didn't feel enormous. It felt like responsibility. It felt like a man's entire working life converted into a number on a page, and that number was now in my hands, and I could feel the weight of every hour he had spent earning it. My father found out on Tuesday. By Wednesday, his attorney had contacted Harold Endicott requesting a meeting. Harold declined. He told me about it over the phone in that same measured voice, and I could hear something that might have been satisfaction but was probably just precision. He said, "Your father's attorney used the word contestable." I said, "It is not contestable." He said, "I know." He said, "Your grandfather made sure of that." By Thursday, my mother called. That was harder. Her voice was thin and rushed, and she spoke in fragments the way she always did when my father was nearby and she was trying to say something honest before he noticed. She said, "Elena, honey, I want you to know I didn't agree with what happened at the dinner." She said, "I tried to talk to him." She said, "You know how he is." I said, "Yes, I know how he is." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you eating enough?" And I said, "Yes, Mom, I'm eating enough." And then I heard his voice in the background, sharp and metallic, and she said, "I have to go, sweetheart," and the line went dead. I sat with that for a long time. My mother had loved me in the spaces between his attention. She had loved me in whispers and side glances and quick squeezes of my hand under the table at restaurants. She had loved me the way a person loves, when they believe love is something that must be hidden to survive. I didn't blame her. I had spent years doing the same thing. But I was done with it now, and the difference between us was that I had someone who had shown me what it looked like to stop. On Friday, Jim Hodges called. Jim Hodges, who had been laughing with my father at the bar while I stood in front of the room with my hand on my belly. Jim Hodges, who ran the auto dealership and sat on the town council and played golf with my father every other Saturday. He called and he said, "Elena, this is Jim, and I wanted to say I thought what you did at the dinner was brave." He said, "I've known your grandfather a long time, and I think he would have been proud." I thanked him. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that bravery observed and bravery supported are two very different things, and he had been in the room and he had not said one word. But people are complicated. I was learning that. People carry their courage in small containers, and sometimes the container is only big enough for a phone call 3 days later. And maybe that has to be enough. The following Monday, I drove to Harold's office and signed the final transfer documents. He had everything organized in a leather binder with tabs. He walked me through each section. The house would need a new roof within 2 years. The commercial property had a tenant whose lease renewed in March. The investment accounts were conservatively allocated, and he recommended leaving them as they were for now. He said all of this with the calm of a man who has spent decades turning chaos into paper and paper into order. When we finished, I asked him something I had been carrying since the gala. I said, "Did my grandfather ever say why he did it this way? Why he didn't just tell my father? Why he let it be a surprise?" Harold looked at me over his glasses. He said, "Arthur told me once that some people only hear the truth when it arrives in a form they cannot argue with." He said a conversation can be dismissed, a legal document cannot. Then Harold smiled, just barely, and said, "Your grandfather was a mechanic." He believed in things that worked. I drove home from Harold's office that afternoon with the windows down even though it was cold. February air sharp enough to sting my cheeks, and I let it. There was something clarifying about the discomfort. My daughter was asleep in her car seat behind me, her small fists curled against the blanket my grandmother had crocheted years ago, the one with uneven edges because Grandma Ruth never had the patience for straight lines. She used to say, "Perfection is for people with nothing better to do." I think about that sometimes. I think about how she and Grandpa built a life that was warm and imperfect and completely sturdy, like a house with creaky stairs that never once shifted in a storm. Grandpa's phrase came back to me that night. I was sitting on the floor of the cottage living room with Lily on a blanket beside me, and I was sorting through a box of his things that Harold had given me. Old photographs mostly, a few letters, his military service records from Korea, yellowed and brittle. And at the bottom, a small spiral notebook with his handwriting. The kind of tight, even letters you see from men who learn to write in schools that still cracked rulers across knuckles. Most of it was mundane: grocery lists, measurements for shelving, a phone number with no name next to it. But on one page, near the middle, he had written something that stopped me. He wrote, "You do not owe the world your anger. You owe yourself the life you would have lived without it." I read it 3 times. Then I closed the notebook and held it against my chest and sat there in the quiet for a long time. Because here is what I have been turning over since that night at the gala. Since my father's face went white, since my brother stopped calling, since my mother left that voicemail asking me to please just think about what I was doing to the family. Here is the thing I keep circling. I waited too long. I know that. Not too long to act. I acted when the moment came, and I am not sorry for any of it. But too long to see clearly. Too long to stop hoping that the next time would be different. That if I was patient enough, quiet enough, useful enough, my father would look at me and see me. Not a problem. Not an inconvenience. Not the daughter who reminded him of his own father in ways that made him uncomfortable. Just me. I spent 26 years waiting for something that was never going to arrive by waiting. And I think about the cost of that. The years I spent performing competence in his direction like a dog doing tricks for someone who has already left the room. The way I volunteered for every difficult shift, took every hard deployment, earned every commendation. And each time, somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a small voice saying, maybe this one. Maybe this will be the one that makes him proud. It never was. And the fault is not entirely his. Some of it is mine. I kept feeding coins into a machine that had no mechanism to give anything back. I do not say this to excuse him. What he did the night he threw me out was unforgivable, not because of the act itself, but because of what it revealed. That his image of himself as a respectable man mattered more than his pregnant daughter standing in the cold. That is not a mistake. That is architecture. That is a man who built his entire identity on the idea that he was owed obedience, and when obedience stopped, he had nothing left to offer. I understand that now. I did not understand it at 26. At 26, I thought I had failed him. At 27, holding my daughter in a cottage that my grandfather left me because he knew this would happen. I understand that the failure was never mine. But understanding does not erase the ache. That is the part they do not tell you about in stories like this. You can win. You can stand in a ballroom and watch the man who hurt you realize that he has no power left, and you can feel the ground shift beneath your feet, and you can walk out into the night air feeling taller than you have ever felt. And then you can go home and sit on the floor and miss him. Not the man he was, the man you needed him to be. The father who existed only in the space between your hope and reality. That man never lived, but you mourn him anyway. Lily made a sound beside me, not a cry, a small hum, the way babies do when they are dreaming about something their brains are too new to name. I picked her up and held her against my shoulder, and I made a promise. Not a grand one, not the kind you announce. The kind you make quietly in a dark room with no witnesses. I promised her that I would never make her earn my attention, that she would never have to win a medal or a degree or a war to hear me say that I was proud of her, that she would know every single day that being herself was sufficient, that she was not a project or a reflection or a debt. I thought about Grandpa's notebook again. You do not owe the world your anger. He was right, but I would add something to it now, something I think he knew but did not write down because he was a man of few words, and even fewer unnecessary ones. You do not owe the world your anger. But you do owe yourself the willingness to stop pretending that silence is the same thing as peace. I was silent for years, and I called it patience. I called it strength. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was just fear wearing a better dress. I am not angry at my father anymore. I want to be clear about that. Anger requires a kind of investment, and I have withdrawn my shares. What I feel is something quieter, a sadness that sits low in the chest like a stone you have carried so long you forget it is not part of your body. I will probably carry it for a long time, maybe always, but it does not run my life. It does not make my decisions. It is just there, the way a scar is there, evidence of something that happened and healed imperfectly, and taught you where the edges of the world are. The apartment is quiet now. Liam is asleep in the next room. That particular silence of a baby who fought consciousness for 40 minutes and then surrendered all at once, mid-cry, as if someone flipped a switch. I can hear him breathing through the monitor, that soft, static hiss underneath, the white noise machine doing its work, and then his breath, steady and unknowing, and perfect in the way that only a sleeping child's breath can be. I am sitting on the balcony. It is late October, and the air has that first real bite to it, the kind that tells you summer is not coming back, not for a long time, and you should stop waiting. Below me, the street is wet. It rained an hour ago, one of those fast autumn rains that come sideways and leave everything smelling like iron and cold leaves. The street light on the corner catches the puddles and turns them into small, bright wounds on the pavement. Across the road, someone's kitchen light is on. I can see the shape of a person moving behind the curtain, doing dishes, maybe. Or just standing there the way people stand in kitchens late at night when they cannot sleep and do not want to admit it. I have a cup of tea that I made 20 minutes ago and have not touched. It is cooling in my hands. I do not mind. There is something about holding a warm cup and letting it go cold that feels honest right now. Like I am not pretending to be in a hurry. Grandpa used to sit like this, on his back porch in Bexley, after everyone had gone to bed, with a mug of something he never finished. I would find him there sometimes when I was small and could not sleep. I would push open the screen door and he would not startle. He would just move over slightly, making room on the step, and we would sit together without talking. The garden smelled like wet soil, and the roses he pruned every Sunday with scissors that were too small for his hands. He never asked me why I was awake. He understood that sometimes a person just needs to sit next to someone who is not asking anything of them. You are not what happens to you. You are what you decide to carry forward. I used to think that was about toughness, about gritting your teeth and pushing through and refusing to let the world see you buckle. I was wrong. It was never about toughness. It was about choosing. Choosing what gets to live inside you and what gets left on the road behind you because it was never yours to begin with. My father's disappointment was never mine. His shame, his need to control the story of who his daughter was, his terror at what the neighbors might think. None of that belonged to me. I carried it anyway for years because daughters do, because women do, because it felt like the price of being loved, even though the love it bought was conditional and brittle and broke the first time it was tested. I decided to put it down. That is the whole story, really. Everything else, the lawyer's call, the inheritance, the courtroom, the numbers and the legal terms, and the look on my father's face when the judge read the ruling, all of that was just the mechanism, the gears turning. The real thing, the thing that actually changed my life, was the decision. Quiet. Private. Made in a hospital room at 4 a.m, while a newborn slept on my chest, and the world outside was dark, and I understood for the first time that I was allowed to build something that did not include the people who had decided I was not enough. Liam shifts in his crib. The monitor picks up a small sound, half sigh, half murmur, and then silence again. I wait. You learn to wait. You learn that not every sound requires a response, that sometimes the bravest thing is to stay still and let the moment pass on its own. I think about calling my father sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Late at night, usually, when the apartment feels too quiet and the old muscle memory kicks in, that reflex to reach for the person who hurt you, because at least hurt is familiar. I never do it. Not because I am punishing him, because I have nothing to say that he is ready to hear, and I am done performing for an audience that has already decided the show is bad. He called me once, 3 weeks after the hearing. I let it ring. He did not leave a message. I sat there looking at his name on the screen until it disappeared, and I felt something I did not expect. Not anger, not satisfaction. Just a kind of exhaustion. The deep, bone-level tiredness of someone who has finally finished a race she did not want to run. My mother texts me now. Short messages, careful ones. Photos of flowers in her garden, no words attached. I send back a photo of Liam sometimes. We do not talk about what happened. Maybe we will. Maybe we will not. I have stopped needing that conversation to happen on a schedule. Some things mend slowly and in silence, and you have to let them. The tea is fully cold now. I set it on the railing and pull my sweater tighter. The street below is empty. Somewhere, a few blocks over, a car alarm goes off and stops. The kitchen light across the road has gone dark. Whoever was standing there has gone to bed, or given up, or found whatever they were looking for. If you are listening to this and you recognize any of it, the silence you kept because speaking felt more dangerous than swallowing, the family that loved you only when you fit the shape they had already drawn, the moment you realized that the price of belonging was the whole of yourself, I want to tell you something. You are allowed to leave the room. You are allowed to build the door yourself if there is not one. You are allowed to be heartbroken about it and still walk through. You do not owe anyone your disappearance. I stand up. I go inside. I check on Liam one more time, leaning over the crib, watching his chest rise and fall in the blue glow of the nightlight. His fist is curled near his mouth. His eyelids flutter. He is dreaming about something I will never know, and that is fine. That is more than fine. He will have his own life, his own choices, his own quiet nights on a balcony somewhere, and I will not make him carry mine. I close the door softly. The hallway is dark, and I do not turn on the light. I know the way by now.